Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Salam alaikum. Should you happen to be in the Arab region, the Middle East, the Islamic world, or Europe, or in a different time zone than Eastern Standard Time in the United States. My name is Dr. John Duke Anthony. I'm the founding president and chief executive officer of the National Council on U.S. Arab Relations, which is a non-governmental organization. It has as its vision to place the Arab-U.S. relationship on as firm a foundation as possible, firmer than it has been, firmer than it is, and firmer than it is likely to be unless enough good people on all sides of the relationship have this as the high priority and work diligently and assiduously and indefatigably to accomplish this objective. And today we're focusing on a controversial and some would even say a contentious topic, and that has to do with America's relationship with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. It is a contentious relationship because for the better part of the last 60 years, there have been many people in the United States who would view Saudi Arabia as not as a friend, let alone a partner, let alone a strategic ally. They would regard it as an adversary. And this is in large measure because of what Saudi Arabia is. It is the captain of the 57 Islamic countries, the most important country in the 28 nation Middle East, and the 22 countries belong to the League of Arab States, 22 Arab countries there. And here we have a country that is pivotal to international economies. It obtains, possesses, and produces and exports the hydrocarbon fuels that power the engines that drive the economies of every country in the world, large and small, new and old, everything in between, intermediate as well. With regard to its importance, it goes without saying in the sense of what it has, prodigious amounts of petroleum. It has more than 10 times proven reserves of the United States of America. 5 times a day, billions of Muslims worldwide bend in obeisance towards Saudi Arabia geographically, directionally, for their prayers. Once in their lifetime, they do their best to participate in the pilgrimage to Mecca and Medina in Saudi Arabia. We have a country that is of enormous importance nationally to its citizens. Obviously, it goes without saying, but it also has impact on its neighborhood. Therefore, it has a regional impact in addition to the national one. And then because of its peculiar, at times, particular relationship with the United States consistently, it has a global impact and effect. So this is no small country, despite the fact that many are envious of it, see it as an adversary, jealous of it. There's not a country on the planet that would not trade places with the United States in its relationship with the United States, nor among Arab, Middle Eastern, and Islamic countries are there any that would not trade places with Saudi Arabia in terms of its long-standing special relationship with the United States, and going on 8 decades now. Here you have a situation where America's interests are to be categorized as follows in the descending order of importance. An overall strategic importance in terms of the bearing that Saudi Arabia has, together we have on matters of global peace and matters pertaining to security, matters pertaining to stability, matters pertaining to the prospects for peace. So here you have a situation where strategy has trumped, no pun intended, the political aspects of the relationship. There we have, as the head of state of the United States, Joe Biden, who on the campaign trail mentioned Saudi Arabia in terms of a pariah, and that he would not have anything to do with it as long as it remained that pariah-like state. And yet here you find the head of state of the most powerful country on the planet, within a matter of days, getting on Air Force One and going to Saudi Arabia to meet with the crown prince of the kingdom, something that he implied he would hardly give serious and favorable consideration to do. And so in terms of America's needs, America's concerns, America's interests, America's objectives, you find the strategic objectives there of security, of stability, of peace, and the prospects for prosperity trumping the political dynamics of what one in an ideal world or a different world would do differently, where the world structured in realities profoundly different. We have three people to focus on this challenging topic this morning for the better part of an hour and a half. With regard to our moderator, Colonel Abbas Dahouk, who was former U.S. Army attaché and U.S. Defense attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Saudi Arabia. And he is a lifelong foreign affairs officer who taught not just Arabic, but also Farsi at the United States Military Academy at West Point, New York. Colonel Abbas, retired now, is the president of his own firm, Hyphen Point Limited. He's a member of the board of directors and a very active, proactive, and effective member of the National Council on U.S. Arab Relations. Joining him will be former career Foreign Service Officer David Rundell. David Rundell is no stranger to anybody who has lifted a book and turned a page pertaining to Saudi Arabia and America's representation to the kingdom in the last 4 decades. He's the only American I know who has served intensive, extensive tours of duty in the Eastern Province at the Consulate General at Dhafran, also at the U.S. Embassy in Riyadh, and the U.S. Consulate General in Jeddah. And he served as the chief of mission at the U.S. Embassy in 2009. At an earlier stage in his career before retirement, he also was the Department of State's liaison to Congress, to Capitol Hill, both houses of legislative branch. Joining him will be Ambassador retired Michael Gufella, who brings linguistic skills to this task, and namely in terms of his being proficient in Russian, Arabic, French, and German. Both have been with us before, and both are as incisive a set of analysts, examiners, estimators of any two one will find this morning or this evening, wherever you may be, focusing on the implications of President Biden's forthcoming visit to Saudi Arabia, the implications and the opportunities that are embedded in this seminal event in the bilateral relationship with respect to which the entire world will be watching. Colonel Dahouk.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Anthony, for this introduction. And also good day to all our listeners in the United States and everywhere. And I also extend my welcome to our esteemed guests, Mr. David Rundell and Ambassador Michael Gefeller. to our discussion today on implications and opportunities for the U.S. and Saudi relationship. We also have upcoming visit for President Biden. That's also another key, will be a key element in this relationship. As Dr. Anthony mentioned, that Saudi Arabia is not a country to forget about or to just downplay. The same thing, the United States is a country that one wants them to be a strategic partner. So both countries have a lot to offer. This visit, I think, is going to be historic. It will perhaps calibrate relationship. We have to see. I think it's going to be as historic as the Trump's visit and the President Trump visit in May 2017, which when I was the defense attaché at that time, had the opportunity to plan for the visit and be with the visit and work after the visit. And it was pretty historic in a different way. President Trump did a very minor historic thing at that time where he decided to fly directly from Riyadh to Tel Aviv. That was usually the presidents or secretaries, they have to do a technical stop because of lack of diplomatic relationship with Israel, but he decided to fly directly. I think it seems like President Biden is doing the same thing, but in reverse. He will be flying directly from Tel Aviv to Jeddah this time to attend this GCC summit. And Saudi Arabia, in return, they did prep the battlefield, like we say, for the visit. Saudis, they have the privilege and the power to summon GCC, as they did. And they also have 3 countries along with the GCC to participate, to also welcome the president there. You have Egypt, Jordan, and Iraq. And on top of that, we saw the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Prince Mohammed bin Salman, did his tour. He went, visited Egypt, was welcomed as a head of state in Egypt and also in Turkey and in Jordan. And to solidify the Arab or those 6 plus 3 countries, their position together, whether on the economic side, on the defense side, or basically how to deal with Russia and how to deal with China. So now it's the president's term, President Biden, to visit and see what he has to deliver. So I'll start with a question for both of you, gentlemen, and you can add a little flavor from historical flavor or political flavor or diplomatic flavor on what does you think now President Biden realistically hope to accomplish in this visit?
Well, I think that you can hear me? Okay, Mike and I have thought about this, and we have agreed that I will talk about the elements that deal with energy and the peace process or the Arab-Israeli dispute. And Mike will talk more about defense relationships and the regional stability aspects of the U.S. Saudi relationship. So as most people know, the usual, what is usually referred to as the fundamental underpinning of the Saudi-American relationship is energy and security. So we've divided that up. And I would argue also that there is more to it than that, but those are important points. So with that little bit of introduction, I would say that in the 40 years that I have been watching the Saudi-American relationship, it has never been in worse shape than it is today. That's quite a statement when you think about 1973 and the oil embargo, or 2001 and the 9/11 attacks. But I think it's an accurate statement for the following reason. After the Arab oil embargo, which the Saudis actually tried to prevent, the Secretary of State and Secretary of the Treasury, Kissinger and Schlesinger, quickly realized that we still needed a strong relationship with Saudi Arabia, that the Saudis should be brought into a closer relationship, not pushed away. In other words, not made a pariah, but made a partner. And they actually went to great lengths to do that, to intertwine the Saudi economy with the American economy in a whole range of ways that built the relationship. The same really could be said after 9/11. As the 9/11 Commission demonstrated quite clearly, the Saudi government was not the source of those attacks, and that they themselves were then attacked by Al-Qaeda the following year. So, in fact, the counterterrorism cooperation that evolved after Al-Qaeda became a global menace actually strengthened the American relationship again with Saudi Arabia, and President Bush entertained King Abdullah at his ranch in Texas on 2 occasions to help rebuild the relationship. So this time it's quite different. This time we actually have the White House leading the charge, if you will, on trying to put distance between Saudi Arabia and the United States. And that we also now have a new generation of leaders in Saudi Arabia. The sons of King Abdullah, or King Abdulaziz, were all brought up in their fundamental thinking that the relationship with the United States was paramount to the security of Saudi Arabia. The new generation does not necessarily share that view, and they certainly have grown up in a world where China and Russia are both making increasingly important economic and political inroads into the Middle East. So the relationship is in poor condition. The reasons that the relationship remains important were summarized very clearly by Dr. Anthony. The energy equation is certainly part of it, but I would always argue that in reality, regional stability is really what matters. The Middle East is a strategically volatile but important part of the world. It's not just Saudi oil, but oil from Kuwait, from Iraq, sometimes even from Iran, certainly from the UAE. A disruption in the GCC, and let's be explicit with that, the collapse of the Saudi monarchy would be a disaster for American strategic interests in that part of the world. Let me say that again, that the collapse of the Saudi monarchy would be a disaster for the United States. The government of Saudi Arabia that exists today would not be replaced by a secular liberal democracy. It would be replaced almost certainly by something similar to the Taliban or ISIS, a government that shared neither American values nor American interests. And we have the Islamic Republic of Iran. We don't need the Islamic Republic of Arabia. So Saudi Arabia today is undergoing significant economic and social reforms, things that we have many times encouraged them to do over the years, and which they are now doing. Not really because we encourage them, but because it's in their own interest to do so. And these very much include the emancipation of women, which is a whole talk we could go into. Everyone knows that women can now drive, but there are dozens of other reforms that have helped women. There is an active affirmative action program for women going on in Saudi Arabia, and the same really goes for youth as well, who now have far more opportunities, not only for employment, but for entertainment than they did before. So these are reforms that we should recognize and should encourage. So with that introduction as to perhaps why the relationship is important, and I guess I would add, in addition to regional stability, energy, the third idea is that you are not going to solve the Arab-Israeli dispute, and you are not going to promote a moderate and tolerant form of Islam without the cooperation of the custodian of Mecca. So for all of those reasons, the relationship is important and it needs to be rebuilt. And I think the president deserves credit for recognizing that. Whether he actually ever believed all of the things he said on the campaign trail or not, I don't know. But surely he is having to take some political heat for the fact that he is now combining, if you will, his job, which really combining the two elements of his job, which are to protect both American interests and American values. And he really needs to do both. He is responsible for the security and the prosperity of the American people. And maintaining a relationship with Saudi Arabia is constructive in pursuing those goals. He's also responsible for defending American values. If we abandon our values, we have nothing really to defend with. So he has to find a way to balance this. And in a way, this is the president's dilemma. And I think we should all wish him well and hope that he is able to achieve that balance in his upcoming visit, rather than criticizing him for making the effort. Now, specifically on energy, which most people argue is why he is going in the first place. The reason that we have high gasoline prices in the United States today is threefold. First of all, we have general inflation because we printed a great deal of money to combat COVID, and you can't pump that kind of money into the economy without experiencing some inflation. Secondly, we have the disruptions that are caused by the war in the Ukraine. And thirdly, we have the fact that the Saudis have declined to play their usual role of a stabilizer in the global oil markets. For 50 years, the Saudis have generally been the central bank of energy. They are the only country that maintains a very significant surplus capacity. This is a political decision that they make, not a commercial one. It costs them a lot of money to do this. And when there is a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico, or a strike in Nigeria, or a war in Iraq, or quite honestly, when the United States wants to put sanctions on Venezuela, it's usually the Saudis that step in and make up the shortfall so that there's not a spike in prices. They have not done that this time. And so it is hopeful that we can rebuild our relationship so that they begin to play that role again. I think that it is unrealistic to expect them to abandon their relationship with Russia, which they have worked hard to build, which is called OPEC Plus. I think that a more reasonable expectation is that they will bring forward the date at which they begin to increase their production beyond the agreement that they have with OPEC Plus, and that they'll come up with a new agreement with OPEC Plus. And the reason I say that is because the relationship is in bad shape, and it will require, it's not going to be recalibrated by a photo op. It's going to require confidence building measures on both parts. It is a step-by-step process. It's not going back to where it was overnight. The Saudis are not going to pump 2 million barrels of oil more tomorrow so that motorists see their prices go down. So just to finish that, what I would say on the energy is that what we can hope for is that they agree that they will not begin to price oil in currencies other than the dollar. That's a big deal, and they could do that tomorrow, and that would be very damaging to our standing in the world. Likewise, we should commit that we're not going to put economic sanctions like we did on Russia on China anytime soon, because China is their biggest customer. And that would put them in a very difficult situation. So those are just a couple of things that I would mention on the energy front. The very last thing to say is that the Saudis are playing an important role in the energy transition in a whole lot of ways, in wind and solar, and potentially there's an agreement that we might make with them on nuclear power. So in any event, that is perhaps that's 15 minutes of of your
Good.
time
Thank you.
that I was supposed to speak for. I can talk about the peace process later on after Mike has a chance to talk about regional stability and defense.
Yeah, perhaps we can do that. But thanks. Okay. I don't know if Michael, are you there, Ambassador Kefauver? I think his mic
certainly am,
is
Colonel.
muted.
Good to
Okay.
see you.
Good to see you too. Go ahead. Look at the other side of it. I think you'll talk about political defense or military, whatever you want to talk about at this point. Go ahead.
Right. So, every negotiation involves give and take. We would like something from the Saudis, particularly on energy pricing. I agree with David that there's no chance that the Saudis are going to give up their relationship with Moscow regarding energy. The most important energy alliance in the world right now, I would argue, is that between Riyadh and Moscow. And this is the personal creation of Mohammed bin Salman. He led, along with his brother Abdulaziz bin Salman, the Minister of Energy. He led the negotiations with Alexander Novak, then the Russian Minister of Energy, and now Deputy Prime Minister of the Russian Federation, on creating the OPEC Plus alliance. OPEC Plus is important on two levels. The first is that between them, Saudi Arabia and Russia generate about 20% of global oil production. But because the Russians lead an alliance of former Soviet energy producers, and the Saudis are the dominant producer in OPEC, OPEC Plus really influences the production of about 60% of global energy output, so oil and gas output. So this is huge. It gives them great leverage over oil prices. I don't see any reason for them to give it up. They both suffered a great deal during the COVID era from weak prices and from subsequent revenue losses. We all remember the brief period, I'm sure, when oil prices in this country were actually measured in negative dollars, and producers were paying refineries to take the oil off their hands so they keep the pipelines clear. So no one wants to go back to that. The Saudis and the Russians both need energy revenues at this point for various reasons. I don't see their cooperation ending. It's not in their interest. It could be moderated, however, as David suggested, and that's important. So what would the Saudis want in return? I think what they really want from the United States is improved cooperation in facing the current and the potentially increasing security threat from Iran. We tend to view Iran through the lens of the JCPOA, in other words, the Iranian nuclear agreement, which the administration would like to revive. The chance of reviving it right now seems a bit uncertain. The Saudis are worried about Iranian nuclear breakout if the agreement is not revived. They're also worried about regional nuclear proliferation if that occurs. Several times, Saudi government officials and royal family members have indicated that were Iran actually to achieve nuclear weapon state status, they would have to move in the same direction. And they have their own nascent nuclear program, although it's far behind that in the UAE, which is actually built for nuclear power plants. Nevertheless, this is not your grandfather's Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is a very sophisticated country in terms of technology. In general, it's becoming more so by the day. There are hundreds of thousands of highly trained Saudi scientists and engineers, and the kingdom could construct a successful civilian nuclear power program if it wanted to. And it's made some indications of going in that direction. It's also developed its own ballistic missile program with technology from China. The Saudis now have their own factories in situ for producing ballistic missiles and the necessary fuel. They're all variations of the Chinese East Wind ballistic missiles, which in turn were developed from Soviet technology given to the Chinese in the 70s and the 80s. And of course, the close energy program or cooperation between Saudi Arabia and Moscow means there's a huge potential for an increase in Russian military exports to Saudi Arabia. On his at his various meetings with Mohammed bin Salman, including in Saudi Arabia, a few years ago, President Putin has made it clear that Russia would be happy to step up military cooperation with Saudi Arabia. And so there's a real potential of that happening. Of course, the Russians have far greater leverage over Iran than we do because of their close relationship with Tehran, battlefield cooperation in Syria, coordination on energy prices, military exports. It's a broad and deep relationship. It's important to emphasize, I think, that there's no natural friendship between Moscow and Tehran. Over their long histories, Russia and Iran have been at war, in very significant wars, particularly in the Caucasus in the 19th century, much more often than they've been at peace. But right now, given Russia's reduced status in the world and its efforts to reestablish itself as a regional great power, an alliance with Iran makes sense. And so they have leverage. And the Saudis, who have excellent diplomats, first-rate foreign ministry, are definitely trying to use the relationship with Russia to moderate Iranian behavior. One of the big disappointments the Saudis feel in the security field comes from what they view as an inadequate Western response, and by that I mean both European and American, to the repeated attacks on the territory of the kingdom and the UAE from Yemen, from the territory of Yemen. And they view these as Iranian attacks because, of course, the Houthi government in North Yemen would be incapable of mastering these technologies. I'm speaking about both drones and cruise missiles, as well as Scuds, without Iranian technical assistance, massive Iranian technical assistance. So from the Saudi perspective, Iranian policy in Iran boils down to trying to recreate in Yemen the success they enjoyed in southern Lebanon with the establishment of Hezbollah. The Saudis analyze Iranian policy as essentially being focused on creating, through the Houthi movement, the equivalent situation in Yemen. And this is an intolerable security threat to the Saudis. The Saudi policy in Yemen has actually been very conservative. Job number one from the point of view of Saudi foreign policy is to prevent the Houthis from breaching the southern frontier and threatening southwestern Saudi Arabia. Houthi territorial ambitions, if you listen to what they say, stretch as far north as Jeddah and Taif. And at various points in the past, kingdoms based in Yemen did control these territories in the Middle Ages. So if you look at the Middle East, everyone's territorial claims on their neighbors are so great that you would have to increase the region in terms of its overall extent by 5 times in order to satisfy everybody's claims. So conflict is inevitable. But the Saudis want to defend their southern border. That's the first priority. And the second, of course, ambition is to restore what they view as legitimate governance. In other words, the government now based in Aden, overall of Yemen. That's a tall order right now, given the strength and depth of Iranian support for the Houthi government. But if you look at the number of attacks that have been launched by means of cruise missiles and drones against Saudi and Emirati territory in recent years, it averages out to something like an attack every 2 or 3 days, which is a serious threat. And of course, there have been major attacks on ADNOC and on Aramco. And the Saudis' view is that our support was not, for them in the aftermath of those attacks, was not all that impressive. What they really need help with right now is counter-drone technology and drone technology. And again, they don't think we've been very forthcoming in those areas. They've turned to technology suppliers in Italy. Finmeccanica comes to mind. And they've conducted discussions about drone technology with both Russia and China. I think if we become more willing to share our counter-drone technology and our drone technology with them, that will go a long way toward mending the relationship. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. That's very good rundown from both of you on the energy and also on defense. Both of you agree that regional stability matters, obviously, not just the territorial integrity of Saudi Arabia and fighting Yemen or try to counter Iran. I want to ask you, Michael, a question. Still us on defense question. We a couple of days ago, I think the King of Jordan, King Abdullah, mentioned about he mentioned this Arab NATO or the Middle East, the MESA Middle East Strategic Alliance. I think that seems like this could be one of the discussions. I know back in 2017 when General Mattis or Secretary of Defense Mattis visited in April 2017, that time we had discussion directly with MBS. Actually, Prince Mohammed bin Salman, he briefed General Mattis on this Middle East Strategic Alliance. And very much they want to do something like this, and the GCC plus Egypt. Plus also Jordan, Iraq. And a week ago, also there was a military, you didn't see that much in the Western news, there was a military exercise between Saudi Arabia and Iraq. This is the first time something like this happened since the 90s. So there is a push here to do something. The countries, they feel comfortable to cooperate, at least maybe on the missile defense approach, to do something together. I mean, not the NATO like we know NATO of European NATO with the United States, but their own version of NATO where at least we can defend themselves. What do you think? What do you think the Biden administration will entertain something like this and go forward with it?
Well, I certainly hope so. These ideas have actually been discussed since my time at CENTCOM back in 2008 through 2010, and I think there's a lot of merit to them. We need a mechanism for more seamless military coordination, not just with the Saudis, but between the Saudis and the other members of the GCC, potentially excluding Qatar, given their current foreign and defense policy. And also coordination between the Arab states of the Gulf and our other major partners, Egypt and Jordan. As you know from your own time on the ground in the region, Colonel, it's often been very difficult to make this coordination happen. The air defense systems of the GCC states are still lacking in coordination. You can't really talk about them having a common picture of what's going on in the air yet. And the creation of such a regional organization would really improve military cooperation on the technical level, which is really crucial. Amateurs always discuss strategy, but professionals always end up talking about logistics and technology, and that's where we really need to see greater cooperation. But again, the key to this will be a perception on the part of the Saudis and their allies that we're willing to engage in more serious discussions with them than heretofore about how to counter the growing Iranian threat. Let me just throw this on the table. If Iran develops a functional nuclear force, no matter how small it may be, and they're definitely moving in that direction in my estimation, because uranium enrichment has been stepped up dramatically under the current Iranian regime, as opposed to the previous one. I would say that the chance of regional nuclear proliferation is 100%. It's not just the kingdom and the UAE that could move in that direction, but also Egypt and Turkey. Just to remind everybody, both Turkey and Egypt have signed deals with Rosatom, the Russian government's state-owned producer of civilian nuclear technology, to build nuclear power plants, one near Alexandria in Egypt and one in Turkey. And so the transfer of nuclear technology in the region is already taking place. And everyone in the region, all of our traditional allies, will feel greatly threatened by an Iranian nuclear deterrent if it comes to pass. And so proliferation, possibly involving Turkey, Egypt, and the states of the Gulf, would become a near certainty. We don't like to think about this, just like we didn't like to think 20 years ago about nuclear proliferation to Pakistan and India, but it happened anyway. And we need to be ready for that. And if we don't want it to happen, then we have to be willing to give security guarantees, which could involve extending the American nuclear umbrella beyond the NATO countries to cover the countries of a potential new military cooperation organization embracing our traditional allies in the region. It's really all about the extent to which we're willing to extend the nuclear umbrella. If we extend it, we might be able to avoid proliferation. If we don't, then we'll get proliferation, should the Iranians, as now appears likely, succeed in creating their own nuclear deterrent. Thank you.
Thanks. That was good, and I agree with you. I mean, the United States has to play a larger role in this. I mean, it seems the region is they see a common enemy, at least with Israel, and they wanted to improve that defense cooperation. They want to take it a higher level, not just security cooperation. Come up with some kind of mutual defense agreements or something close to that. Otherwise, the trust is not there. So thanks. So, David.
I think you meant they see a common enemy in Iran.
Correct.
Not Israel. Right.
No, and Israel will also see the same common enemy.
Israel will see the same common enemy, right?
Right, and if Iran becomes nuclear, like Michael was saying, I think the first country to react to it is not Saudi Arabia, it will be Israel, actually, to do something about it, I think. Do you have any comments on the defense side, David?
No, I would simply add, I would echo, really, that's not an addition to what both you and Mike said, that this is something that we've been It makes sense. It's been something that's been looked at for a long time. Part of the problem are amongst the Arabs themselves in the Gulf, but part of the problem for the Biden administration is the domestic politics that would be involved. And that's why I think programs such as this one and efforts such as Dr. Anthony's are important, in that the American people need to have a more sophisticated understanding of what's actually at stake for the United States in its relationship with Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf and Arab states as well. Because as you just pointed out, it makes sense that we should develop some sort of a relationship with them that gives them enough confidence that they don't all go off and create their own nuclear weapons programs. But to do that, we need to be able to have the political will in the United States to provide some kind of guarantees. So that's really all I would say on the, just an echoing of what you both said very eloquently.
Okay, well, thanks, David. So question, let's go to I'm sure, or I'm not sure, perhaps the normalization with Israel could be on the table, since President Biden going to Israel first and coming to Saudi Arabia. David, you mentioned about Saudi Arabia, and also it's a different Saudi Arabia today. Saudi Arabia is important to all this energy issues and leadership issues and all that. But also it's very clear today that a true normalization or a true peace process will not happen if Saudi Arabia is not engaged in it somehow productively. So what do you think about normalization with Saudi? Do you think the Saudi leadership now is ready to move forward with it, or it's going to take some time to see that happen? David?
The first point to note is that Saudi Arabia is a status quo power that likes and seeks stability in the region. At the end of the day, that is really why they are an American partner, because we both seek peace and stability. The Saudis have a lot to lose, both economically and politically, in terms of their own stability. So they like things the way they are. And things that rock the boat, whether that is Nasser and his Arab socialism, or Khomeini and his Islamic revolution, or the Arab-Israeli conflict, are not things that they like. And they would, so the point I'm making is that they would like the Arab-Israeli dispute resolved. And they have consistently supported American efforts to do that for 40 years. And they would like, and they did not object, and they quietly supported the efforts of the UAE and Bahrain and Morocco to come up with the Abraham Accords. So the first thing is that the will is there and has been amongst the leadership for a long time. The second point is that for the average Saudi, the cost-benefit relationship of making peace with Israel is changing. And as I mentioned, there is a generational change taking place. So Saudis over 60 are wedded permanently, in my view, to an Arab nationalist view that it is essential to their own identity to support the Palestinian cause regardless. I think younger Saudis, those under 30, are less committed to that cause. They see their friends in the UAE going to visit Tel Aviv. They see their business colleagues in the UAE making profitable business arrangements with Israel. And they remember, if you will, that two things really. One is that the Palestinians did not support Saudi Arabia when the Iraqis invaded Kuwait. After all that the Saudis had done for the Palestinians, they still did not come to their aid when they were in need. And secondly, there's a belief that the Palestinian leadership in the West Bank is feckless and I wouldn't know what other word I might use, that they are unable or unwilling to make peace. And clearly in Gaza, we have Hamas, which the Saudis view quite rightly as a pawn of the Iranians, who are their existential enemies, if you will. So the point I'm making here is that both at the leadership level and at the, and so the second point really was that the younger Saudis are less wedded to the idea that you have to support the Palestinians, whatever they want. So for those two reasons, both popular and at the leadership level, I think there is a will to move forward. The question is, when would you do that? I don't think that the time to do that is right now, in part because of what I just said, that who would you deal with? The Palestinians have to be included. They can't be ignored. They shouldn't be given a veto, perhaps, but they can't be ignored. And therefore, who do you deal with in the points of the Palestinians? So I don't expect that there's going to be any great progress. And I don't mean to put a wet blanket on this, but I don't think there's going to be a great progress in this Biden trip. I think there will be a reiteration of some things that already happened. For example, overflight of El Al flights flying over Saudi Arabia. That has been, I've seen that mentioned, but in fact, that's already happening. Some sort of agreement on the islands in the Red Sea, which again has already happened, but it could be confirmed in some way. So I think there could be some small steps, but I don't see a big breakthrough. And I would say one other thing, which perhaps will surprise some, but I think it to be accurate, is that the Saudis and the Israelis do not really want the United States playing a mediator role. If you remember, the Oslo Agreement was negotiated without the United States. They did it in Oslo specifically so that the United States would not be aware of it. So to the extent that the Saudis and the Israelis come to an agreement, I think it will be brokered between themselves and not with any particularly important input from the United States. And the last thing to say is that what would be important to the Saudis is the status of Jerusalem. And that, I'm not speaking for the Saudi government, but I think that that would be at least as important to them as the Palestinian issue. And it certainly would be important to bringing along the rest of the Muslim world. So it has to, and that requires some kind of discussion with the Jordanians. So that's my answer. It's rather perhaps too long-winded, but I don't expect a big breakthrough coming from the Biden visit on the peace process. I would say, this is really the last thing, is that one thing that would be helpful is for the Biden administration to stop dismissing the Abraham Accord as irrelevant and insignificant. I think it was significant, and I think that it would be charitable to admit that. So thanks.
Thank you. I do agree with you. The Abraham Accord are significant. And I think at this stage, the regional countries really don't want the United States to dictate to them. They just want them to be on the table to assist and to with it. With that, I'm going to ask Michael, if you put on your diplomatic hat. And so how do you approach this Abraham Accord and normalization with Saudi Arabia?
I would say I agree with what David just said. I think that actually there is enough of a real relationship, albeit an unofficial one, between Israel and Saudi Arabia already for the two countries to reach a stage of normalization without a lot of American involvement. I would just add one thing to his excellent analysis, which is I think what really matters to the Saudis from a religious perspective. Of course, Saudi Arabia is the guardian of the two Islamic holy places, Mecca and Medina, and the geographical center of the Islamic world. What really matters to them is the status of the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock. In other words, the top of the Temple Mount. I've had many discussions with Saudis about this over the years, and they always say the same thing. That's the bottom line. We must have access to the Al-Aqsa Mosque and to the Dome of the Rock, in other words, the top of the Temple Mount. We have no issue with the status of the Wailing Wall, the retaining wall built during the time of King Herod along the side of the mountain. So we're getting into fine details here, but they matter. And I think if that issue can be negotiated properly, then the Palestinian issue will not be the kind of obstacle in the way of normalization that it was in the past, especially given the overwhelming common strategic interest that both Israel and Saudi Arabia have right now in containing the potential and the already extant strategic threat from Iran.
Yeah, thank you. David, I mean, you're expert on history and culture and all the dynamics of the royal family, past and present. I'm sure you've seen MBS, the Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the rise of, with King Salman, and basically he set the stage to become a king. I mean, he's traveled outside the country. He's been was received as a head of state, and he leading the Vision 2030, and he was talking the talk back in 2016, but now he's producing all these results. So what would take, you think, to all this, the Democrats or the Biden administration, others, to accept the fact that Prince Mohammed bin Salman is the person that speaks for Saudi Arabia, for example, in your opinion?
The first thing I would say is that King Salman is still the king of Saudi Arabia. And we need to remember that. The second thing is that on a de facto basis, his son does manage the foreign relations. But I think it's important not to dismiss the king. I think that's what I'm saying, is that you know, he's not King Fahd. When King Fahd was completely incapacitated, that's not the case with King Salman. The second thing to say is that it was King Salman who engineered the rise of Mohammed bin Salman. Mohammed bin Salman did not emerge on his own. He was assisted by his father, who chose him to be the leader over the new leader, over a large number of competing candidates, if you will. And I think that his father's choice has been vindicated by the fact that, as you pointed out, and what I wrote in my book, you know, when I started to write that book, I titled it Vision or Mirage, referring to Vision or Vision 2030, as to say, is this a vision or is this a mirage? And I think if I were writing that book today, I would have to come up with a different title, because it's clearly not a mirage. The changes that have taken place are significant and probably irreversible and continuing. So I think to answer your question, those people who have a visceral, almost knee-jerk reaction to anything Saudi, a negative reaction to anything Saudi, really should look even beyond regional stability and energy interests of the United States. They should look to the things which they themselves place great value on. Women's rights, in particular, but the religious toleration. These are things which Saudi Arabia is dramatically promoting at the moment. Most Americans probably don't know, there's actually a chief rabbi of Saudi Arabia today. I mean, that's pretty shocking, actually. I couldn't believe it. I thought, when I heard that, I thought someone was pulling my leg. But there is, and he performs religious services in Riyadh. That would not have happened 5, 10 years, 7 years ago. Wouldn't have happened under King Abdullah. So I think that the way to change people's minds, if you will, to open people's eyes, is to tell them not, we need to get gasoline prices down, because, to be honest, most of those people who don't like Saudi Arabia are probably driving a Tesla. So They're not going to be interested in that argument. But I think that if you tell them that Saudi Arabia is now becoming a model for other Arab countries to follow in terms of social liberalization, and that they're doing this on their own. And I think this is a point worth making. The Saudis are doing this. We did not send an army to Saudi Arabia. We did not pay billions of dollars to reform the Saudi government. In fact, they usually support things that we ask them to help finance. And the difference between what's happening in Saudi Arabia and what's happening in Afghanistan, where we spent thousands of American lives and billions of American dollars, and now we're watching it go backwards. And Saudi Arabia is going forward on their own. I think that's an argument that people ought to wake up and listen to. And so I think that is the way that you could get people to begin to understand that Saudi Arabia, far from being a pariah, ought to be a partner.
Thank you, David. That's good. On the same topic of Prince Mohammed bin Salman, Michael, we've noticed already that Turkey managed to break away from the Khashoggi case and not use it as a center of gravity of their foreign affairs. What would it take for the United States to follow suit? And I mean, I understand the magnitude of the what happened in the consulate. It's not right and all that. We know that. But we have countries have interests and have values, but also interests are important. So how do you think we can break away from this and rebalance this pursuit of interest versus a pursuit for human rights and issues? Michael.
I think advancing human rights requires a pragmatic diplomatic approach. And, I think it's not difficult to move past the Khashoggi affair. We all know what happened. There was extensive press coverage. But at the end of the day, it's one negative incident in a relationship which represents a tremendous success in the foreign relations of the United States over time. I mean, we've had extensive relations with Saudi Arabia and extensive dialogue with them for years about issues in which they're making tremendous progress right now, including human rights. We ought to celebrate these successes while not overemphasizing the problems that continue to exist. That's just pragmatic diplomacy, and we should never lose sight of our own key foreign interests, which we've been talking about during this hour. So I think just a return to pragmatism would be enough really to move past this issue. We need to return to pragmatic diplomacy as opposed to an excessively ideological approach to diplomacy. And in general, I think we need to build up our diplomatic capacity far more than we have in the past as a country. And all of our friends overseas see this. We've invested tremendous resources in our military capacity and in our intelligence agencies. And we've allowed our diplomatic capacity to wither on the vine. And of course, this kind of investment decision leads to self-fulfilling prophecies. I mean, if you don't have much in the way of diplomatic capacity, then when issues arise in foreign affairs, you're going to tend to react with intelligence methods, with covert methods, or with military force, both of which are much more expensive than diplomacy. Diplomacy is far and away the least expensive way to deal with foreign crises and to promote American foreign interests, including in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. So we need to refocus our government on diplomatic instruments of power.
Yeah, I would just add to that two things. And refocusing, as Mike said, on diplomacy means to balance interests and ideology. And that an excessive focus on ideology, or quite frankly, an excessive focus on human rights, leads to problems, as it did in Iran. You may recall that many people felt we couldn't deal with the Shah of Iran because, after all, he had a bad human rights record. And I would put forth that the people who followed him have a far worse record. The fact of the matter is that a foreign citizen was murdered in a foreign city by a foreign government. If the United States broke relations with every country where that happened, we could shut down the State Department tomorrow. So I think this event needs to be put in perspective. And I think the loss of one foreign life, which was egregious and needs to be held, people need to be held accountable for that. But it needs to be weighed against how many, and there are many, American lives the Saudi-American relationship has saved. And I can speak personally to that Saudi counterterrorism cooperation has saved American lives. So these things, it's not a simple yes and no black and white situation. I think these things need to be weighed. And as Mike said, I think it's time now to begin to re-engage, or at least I think that's what he said, to begin to re-engage with Saudi Arabia.
Thanks, David. And I do agree with you on the counterterrorism. I mean, Saudi Arabia is the number one country that assisted the United States through counterterrorism. Not only in the region, around the world, and that's a fact. And on the diplomacy, I think our common friend Michael Ratney is designated. I think he will be the ambassador to Saudi Arabia. Perhaps he can solve some of these problems for us. I wish him the best of luck. For you, Michael, question. I want to take us to Yemen. We haven't talked much about Yemen. It was very much welcomed from President Biden, which President Trump did not do, is by appointing an envoy to Yemen, and appointed Tim Linderking. And God bless his heart, Tim did a lot of work and moved around, and he's been doing it for a while. But Iran is a complex case, and it's very hard to solve. Now we have a truce. We have a presidential council, I think, working. But how do we let's grade Tim on or the administration on what they did, and what do you think the going forward will be in Yemen, Michael?
Well, I hope that we can maintain the progress that's been achieved so far, but I think it is rather fragile and reversible. And again, I go back to what I said earlier. I think what the Saudis and their allies in the GCC need to see is indications that we are going to commit ourselves, perhaps more than we have in the recent past, to helping them deal with the Iranian threat. They see Yemen correctly as an example of Iranian interference in the affairs of the Arab states, which are numerous. Think of Gaza, think of southern Lebanon. The Houthi movement is the same thing. It's a replication of the Hezbollah experiment, which succeeded so well in Lebanon on Yemeni territory. So I would like to be optimistic, but I'm cautious instead, because I don't see the Iranians backing away from the long-term investment that they've made in Yemen.
David, do you have any comments on Yemen? Any general comment?
Mike knows a lot more about Yemen. I'll leave that to him.
Okay. I think let's see what. Let me go back one more time to Iran, and I think this is something. I mean, like we mentioned earlier, the JCPOA is not working, and I think the compliance is not working. At least Iran is not compliant, and Iran's still a terrorist on the terrorist. Country supporting terrorism list, and the IRGC also a terrorist organization. So, I mean, how do you, what would you think the Biden administration's, or President Biden in his visit, how would he approach that to the Gulf? How would he introduce Iran? How would he explain what we're doing with the JCPOA to the GCC, and what kind of assistance he's going to get from them or ask from them, if he asks that? I don't know if that's a right question to ask, but I would like just any comments around that question from both of you, please.
Well,
Michael.
Regarding Iran, there's a lot we could be doing in Iran, in my opinion, to advance our interests that we have not really done yet. I look at Iran from a perspective of its own internal politics, and I see a very fragile regime that has a terrible track record in terms of the way it treats its ethnic minorities, the way it treats its working class, the way it treats its population in general. Iran is absolutely fraught with internal political tensions, and it would be very easy to weaken the Iranian regime and perhaps produce dramatic internal political change if we adopted in Iran the same approach that we adopted vis-a-vis the Soviet Union during the Soviet period. We were extremely effective at working with refuseniks, with anti-communist workers' organizations, underground trade unions, with religious organizations like the Baptist Church, the Orthodox Church, Jewish organizations, to undermine Soviet power. And in the end, we accelerated, I think, certain internal processes in the Soviet Union that led to dramatic political change. Obviously, we have problems with the current Russian government, specifically in Ukraine, but there's no way you can compare the threat to the United States posed by the current Russian government with threat posed by the Soviet Union. We all grew up in that period and all remember the constant threat of nuclear war, which has largely disappeared. So I think something similar could work in Iran. I think we owe it to the Iranian people, actually, to stand up more publicly, more bravely, more consistently for the rights of minorities in Iran and for the rights of the working class in Iran. Iran has actually vibrant underground anti-government trade unions. No one is doing much to support them at this point. And they have vibrant organizations at the regional level trying to support the rights, for example, of the Ahwazi Arabs, the Kurdish population and such. So there are numerous ways in which we could change the political dynamic inside Iran. I think we've refrained from doing so because we hope that if we focus on the JCPOA, we might be able to achieve a more stable, regional order. But in fact, that approach, in my opinion, has not worked. And it's time to revisit the whole Iranian dossier and see what we can do to protect the Iranian people as opposed to the Iranian regime.
Yeah,
Thank you, Michael.
Would,
go ahead. That was my last question, but go ahead, David, answer that too. Yes.
I'll be quick. On two points. I believe that the Obama administration deserves credit for attempting to bring Iran back into the family of nations. And I think that no one could say that they did not bend over backwards to seek to do this. As someone who lived in the region, I thought this was an ill-starred enterprise. I did not expect it to work. I've watched people look for the so-called Iranian moderates for 30 years. But I thought it was a worthwhile and noble effort. I think by now people should recognize it did not succeed. And I don't think you can completely blame the Trump administration for that. Right now, we're not having much success. And so I think Mike is right, that it's time to recognize that you tried plan A and maybe it's time to try plan B, which means to contain Iran rather than to court Iran. So that would be my first point. And then the second thing was you asked me about Yemen. And when it comes to the internal politics of Yemen, Mike is far more better versed than I am. But I would say that with relationship to the Saudi elements of Yemen, the Saudis, the Iranians are heavily involved they are trying to create something like Hezbollah on the Israelis' northern border for the Saudis on their southern border. And if you are seeking confidence building measures that can very immediately have an impact on rebuilding the Saudi-American relationship, some assistance in their conflict in Yemen would be most welcome. I think that the first of all is that we all have heard about the civilian casualties caused by Saudi airstrikes. First of all, that's several years ago now. Second of all, I don't think that anyone seriously thinks that the Saudis were consciously trying to kill civilians any more than our drone strikes were trying to do that in Pakistan. And so what I think we need to do now is to, again, stop finding reasons to beat the Saudis over the head for something they did several years ago and start trying to work with them on things and help them to make the right choices in the future. And that may include things like helping them with cybersecurity, helping them with air defense security, putting the Houthis back on the terrorist list, and increasing our efforts to interdict Iranian arms shipments that come into Yemen. So those are all things that you could talk about in this upcoming visit, which would begin to put the relationship back on a more even keel.
Thank you.
Colonel
Thank you,
Dowd,
David. Yes, sir.
would you entertain an input or comment from my side?
Sure.
Yes.
My pleasure.
Yes.
Go ahead.
No, I second and italicize Michael's emphasis on diplomacy. For better part of 30 years, the defense budget in terms of assets dealing with their needs, their concerns, and their interests dwarfed the diplomatic foreign service budget, and the results have been obvious there. If we go back to the context, which Michael also underscores, as does David, there are those who talk, well, we have to have stability in order to have security. I would argue, no, it's the other way around. People's more basic need is stability. Security, to not be threatened, so that they can anticipate, so that they can predict, so that they can prepare, so that they can plan. If they cannot do these things, they might as well have no life whatsoever. But if you have security, you have a good chance over time for stability, which would need to be sustained. So the two go hand in hand, but the two are not equal. Security is uppermost, and that leads to stability, not necessarily, if at all, the other way around. And the two combined, joined at the hip, Siamese twins, there provide one a good platform or foundation for the prospects for peace. And the three combined, security, stability, and peace, are oftentimes a winning formula for prosperity, again, sustained over time. And we can see what happens when any of those four are shattered. We're seeing it in the Ukraine. We have seen it in Yemen. Now, you pointed out in the beginning that the president will be meeting also with Egypt and Jordan, as well as the other 5 members of the GCC. Now, if you want to have the interoperability that Michael alludes to that does not exist on missiles and much else in the realm of armed forces technology, this does not happen by accident or coincidence. You have to meet, you have to negotiate, you have to give, you have to take here. The last time that the GCC dealt with a major power to try to seek an agreement of this sort was with the European Union. And it started in 1987, and it continued until 1998 at the summit in Muscat, which I attended, where it stopped, and it has not been resumed. And a big reason it stopped was because the European Union continued to move the goalposts, especially in the realm of intrusion in the domestic affairs of the GCC countries. And so the degree to which we are going to italicize, neonize, and pulverize the human rights issue, this can be counterproductive, and it's likely to be counterproductive because there's no counterbalance there. There's no GCC or Saudi Arabian intrusion to anywhere remotely near the comparable scale in the United States, where 1/3 of all people in the world behind bars are behind bars in the United States, and where in the last 22 years, you've had 2 major presidential elections where the person who got the most votes lost. And you're still in a contentious situation where the United States is polarized. So we need to go light on the preaching, on the pontification, on the pomposity, and hold up a mirror to ourselves and be empathetic in our approach in this particular regard, and to highlight the role of countries like Oman and Qatar and Kuwait and what they have done, along with Saudi Arabia, behind the scenes to bring about the ceasefire and the renewal of it in Yemen. This kind of an example on the diplomatic front holds out great prospects. Greater intrusion on the domestic affairs of any or all of these countries is going to boom around and not be productive at all. Look at the stability and the security that you have in Saudi Arabia. You have a degree of security in these 6 countries that arguably has not existed in the last 40 years among any other 6 geographically contiguous neighbors in the 130 emerging countries there. You've had this particular entity of the GCC countries that helped us mightily to prevent the Iranian Revolution from extending to the western side of the Gulf. You had it help us mightily geopolitically and bringing about the debacle of the lack of success in Afghanistan. And you had a signal contribution to the reversal of Iraq's aggression against Kuwait. And so engaging all 6 of these, not just Saudi Arabia, but also, of course, Jordan and Egypt, will be essential. But also essential will be agreement on the ground rules, no intrusion in the domestic affairs of these countries. You can see this source of stability, or a great measure of it in the case of Saudi Arabia, where 51% of the population, women, are more pro this particular de facto head of state than any previous Saudi Arabian head of state. And you also have the youth. There are very few appointments to positions of significance to anyone who's over the age of 40 years old. This too is unprecedented. And then you have a member of the ruling family taking on other members of the ruling family on grounds of corruption there and issuing a zero tolerance. These are sources of stability and security, arguably, in any country. And credit must be given where credit is due.
Thank you, Dr. Anthony. I think we exhausted all our time. Just before
I'll just make one last comment, if
yeah,
I can make
yeah.
one quick comment on the
Yeah.
question of the
Make
other
it your
Arab leaders, the other Arab states that will be there.
Make it your final comment, David, because I'm going to ask
This
also.
will be my final comment.
Okay.
In terms of the other Arab states that will be there, most notably Jordan and Egypt,
Okay.
we face a coming problem. I think the issue for good diplomats is to look ahead, perhaps for anyone in life, is to be able to look ahead. Right now, you don't need to have a crystal ball to see that energy prices and food prices are rising dramatically for a number of reasons. And that this is going to put great strain on the economies and public order in a lot of Arab countries that import wheat, that import fuel. And the likelihood of another Arab Spring, which I would argue was far from being a glowing success that some people thought it was going to be, but in fact precipitated the revolution and disruption across the Arab world, which we're still feeling the effects of. If we want to prevent something like that happening again, we're going to need to pay attention to the significant amounts of aid that some of these countries are now going to need, and that the people that are most likely to be able to help with that are the Saudis, who have helped in that way, along with the UAE and Kuwait and the other oil-producing states, and Qatar. So I think that is really a key issue that they're going to have to discuss, because these people are going to be needing help, and how the United States plays a role in that is important for them all to agree upon.
Thank you, David. Very well said. Thank you. Michael, any final thoughts?
Yeah, again, I want to go back to the point I made earlier about the need to re-emphasize diplomacy as a key element among our instruments for projecting national power. it's way overdue at this point. I also think we need to begin to acknowledge, Saudi Arabia as a tremendous example of the success of U.S. Foreign policy. When I was deployed to Saudi Arabia in 2004 from Iraq, I remember the tremendous threat to the existence of the Saudi regime from Al Qaeda that existed at the time. Working together with the Saudis, we defeated Al Qaeda and drove it out of Saudi Arabia. That was a huge success. And since then, Saudi Arabia under King Abdullah and now under King Salman and Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince, taken dramatic steps forward in all sorts of areas in terms of its social organization and human rights, women's rights, economic liberalization. We ought to be celebrating these successes and reinforcing them rather than ignoring them. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I agree. I remember that 2004 and 2005 we were together at the embassy at that time. And you're right, as I mentioned earlier, as Saudi Arabia is not a country to forget about or downplay its strategic significance, not only in the region, it has also global, whether on the energy side or on the religious side. So thank you very much. I would like to now pass it for Dr. Anthony for his brief, if you have any brief last minute closing remarks, Dr. Anthony.
No, thank you for superb moderation, Colonel Dahouk, and for your incisive analysis and assessments and prognoses on the part of David Rundell. And we wish him further success on his book, which has achieved already significant success in terms of focusing on vision or mirage there. And Michael Gofella as well for his longstanding intensive and extensive exposure to the realities on the ground with the players, with the policymakers, with the opinion formulators, and with the decision makers in Riyadh. This is but one of a year-round series of educational missions. That is a mission, one word, education, through publications, through these webinars, through these Zoom briefings, through the 225 members of Congress and their staff and defense and foreign policy advisors we've taken to the region, to the 50,000 young Americans and Arabs that we have provided experiences in leadership training. Indeed, tomorrow is going to be an all-day session at the National Council on U.S. Arab Relations, where we have 23 students, each one representing a different Arab country in the League of Arab States Secretariat, in the practice of empathy and reading and writing and editing under atrocious deadlines, writing quickly, effectively, and rapidly, editing quickly, rapidly, and effectively, and speaking quickly, rapidly, and effectively, all under atrocious deadlines, and judges. So this is but one brick in the edifice that we're seeking to build. Thank all three of you for your careers, your dedication to public service, your selflessness, and your willingness to share your hard-earned expertise, your knowledge, your understanding, your information, your insight. All the best to everyone. And thank you for viewing and listening and participating. I'm John Duke Anthony, President of the National Council on U.S. Arab Relations. All the best to everyone. Goodbye.